Welcome to Her Journey, the place for raw, unfiltered stories of women who conquered injustice and achieved victory. Don't just listen and leave. Hit subscribe so you'll never miss another story that speaks to your soul. Tonight's journey will take you through betrayal, transformation, and the coldest revenge you've ever heard. This is Her Journey. My name is Diane Whitmore, and at 58, I thought I understood the shape of betrayal. I was wrong. The worst betrayal comes wrapped in love, delivered on a holiday meant to honor you, signed with a name you've whispered in prayers since the day you first held him in your arms. It was Mother's Day morning when the knock came. Not the gentle tap of a neighbor or the hurried bang of a delivery driver running behind schedule. This was different. 3 deliberate beats against my front door, measured and precise, like a judge's gavel announcing a verdict. I had been standing in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd made countless birthday cakes and bandaged scraped knees, pouring my morning coffee into the blue ceramic mug Alex had made me in 3rd grade. The handle was chipped now, worn smooth by 25 years of my fingers, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. Some memories are too precious to discard, even when they cut you every time you hold them. The coffee was black, no cream, no sugar. I'd given up sweet things after my divorce from Rick's father 15 years ago. Life had taught me that bitter was safer. Bitter didn't lie to you. Bitter didn't promise what it couldn't deliver. The knocking came again, and I set the mug down on the granite countertop Rick had insisted on when we renovated 3 years ago. Everything in this house bore his touch now. The modern fixtures, the sleek appliances, the cold perfection of a life carefully curated for appearances. Sometimes I missed my old kitchen with its worn linoleum and chipped paint, where love had been more important than luxury. I walked to the front door, my bare feet silent on the polished hardwood floors. Through the peephole, I could see a man in a brown delivery uniform, his cap pulled low over his eyes. In his hands was a small cardboard box, unremarkable except for the way it seemed to absorb the morning light. "Delivery for Diane Whitmore," he said when I opened the door. His voice was neutral, professional, but something in his eyes made me pause. There was a flicker of something, pity, maybe, or knowledge of what was coming. He extended the box toward me, and I took it automatically. It was heavier than its size suggested, substantial in a way that made my fingers tingle. The label was printed in neat, impersonal letters, but my heart stopped when I saw the sender's name, Alex Whitmore. My son. My beautiful, brilliant, complicated son who hadn't spoken to me in 3 years, not since the fight that tore our family apart like tissue paper. Not since the day he looked me in the eye and told me I was dead to him. I signed for the package with trembling fingers, hardly aware of the delivery man walking away. A gift. On Mother's Day. Maybe this was his way of reaching out, of building a bridge across the chasm that had opened between us. Maybe my prayers had finally been answered. I carried the box into the kitchen like a precious offering, my heart hammering against my ribs. Rick was at the breakfast table, hidden behind his morning newspaper and his perfectly pressed suit. At 62, he was still handsome in that silver-haired, country club way that had first attracted me when I was vulnerable and grieving my first marriage. But handsome, I'd learned, could hide so many ugly things. He looked up when I entered, and his eyes immediately fixed on the box in my hands. The newspaper crumpled in his grip. The color drained from his face so completely that for a moment I thought he might faint. Where did that come from? His voice was sharp, cutting through the morning quiet like a blade. A delivery man just brought it. It's from Alex. I couldn't hide the hope in my voice, the desperate joy of a mother who thought her prodigal son had come home. Rick set his coffee mug down hard enough to slosh coffee onto the table. "Don't open it." I laughed, a sound brittle with confusion. "What? Why not? Can't you see it?" His voice carried an edge I'd only heard a few times before, when he thought someone was trying to cheat him in business, when he smelled danger, like a predator scenting blood. I turned the box in my hands, studying it more carefully. It was small, maybe 6 inches square, wrapped in plain brown paper. The tape was applied with mechanical precision, each strip perfectly parallel to the others. Inside, something shifted with a soft, metallic whisper. "Rick, it's just a gift for my son. It's Mother's Day."
No.
He stood so abruptly his chair scraped against the floor. "Diane, I'm serious. Call the police." "The police? Are you insane? It's from Alex." But even as I said it, doubt crept in like poison. Alex, who had cut me out of his life completely. Alex, who had ignored every birthday card, every Christmas gift, every desperate attempt to reconcile. Why would he suddenly send me something now? Rick's hands were shaking as he reached for his phone. "I'm calling them myself." "Rick, stop being paranoid. Look at me, Diane." His eyes were wild, desperate. "Look at me and tell me you trust him. Tell me you trust the son who hasn't spoken to you in 3 years to suddenly send you a gift out of the blue." The words hit me like a physical blow. Because I couldn't. I couldn't tell him I trusted Alex, because somewhere deep in my heart, I knew Rick was right. The son I'd raised, the boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard and call them roses, wouldn't send me a gift without explanation. Not after 3 years of silence. Not without strings attached. The box suddenly felt heavier in my hands, weighted with malice instead of love. "What do you think it is?" I whispered. "Nothing good," Rick said, his finger already dialing 911. The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of blue and red lights, uniformed officers tramping through my pristine home, and questions I couldn't answer. They treated me with professional courtesy at first, "Ma'am this, ma'am that," but I could see the calculation in their eyes. A woman my age, living in a house like this, receiving mysterious packages. They'd seen this movie before. Officer Martinez, a compact woman with intelligent eyes and graying temples, took charge of the situation. She studied the box with the practiced gaze of someone who'd seen too much to be surprised by anything. "Ma'am, we're going to need to open this carefully. Can you step back, please?" I watched from the doorway as she used a box cutter to slice through the tape with surgical precision. The cardboard fell away like petals from a dying flower, revealing a black velvet jewelry case nestled in tissue paper. Officer Martinez lifted the case with gloved hands and opened it slowly. Even from across the room, I could see the contents gleaming under the kitchen lights: thick gold chains, heavy bracelets, rings set with stones that caught the light like captured fire. "Ma'am," Officer Martinez said, her voice carefully neutral, "can you explain this jewelry?" I stared at the contents of the case, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The pieces were beautiful, expensive-looking, but completely foreign to me. I'd never seen any of them before in my life. "No," I said, my voice coming out smaller than I intended. "I've never seen any of this before." The officers exchanged glances that spoke volumes. In their world, expensive jewelry arriving in unmarked packages meant only one thing: stolen goods. And the person receiving them was usually in on the scheme. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with us to answer some questions," Officer Martinez said, her tone still professional but firmer now. "Questions? About what?" "I told you, I don't know anything about this jewelry. We believe these items are connected to an ongoing investigation into stolen property. We need to determine how they came to be in your possession." My legs felt weak, but I didn't possess them. They were sent to me. I didn't even open the box. "Ma'am, legally, once you accepted the package, you were in possession of its contents." The room spun. This couldn't be happening. Not to me. Not on Mother's Day. Not from a gift I'd hoped was a gesture of love from my estranged son. "Rick," I said, Turning to my husband, Tell them. Tell them I had nothing to do with this. But Rick was backing away from me, his face a mask of horror, and something else, something that looked like relief. As if he'd been expecting this moment and was glad it had finally arrived. I don't know anything about this, officers, he said. I told her not to open it. I had a bad feeling. Betrayal cut through me like a cold blade. My husband of 8 years, the man I'd trusted with my heart and my home, was throwing me to the wolves without hesitation. Ma'am, you'll need to come with us now. I was still wearing my slippers when they put the handcuffs on me. The metal was cold against my wrists, and the sound they made when they clicked shut was the loneliest sound I'd ever heard. As they led me to the police car, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman staring back at me looked old, defeated, broken. Her silver hair was disheveled, her face pale with shock. She looked like someone who deserved to be in handcuffs. I didn't recognize her at all. The last thing I saw before they put me in the back of the police car was Rick, standing in our doorway with his arms crossed, watching me being taken away with the detached interest of someone observing a stranger's misfortune. He didn't wave goodbye. The holding cell smelled like industrial disinfectant and despair. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead with the persistence of angry insects, casting everything in a sickly green pallor that made everyone look like corpses. The walls were concrete block painted institutional beige, and the floor was polished cement that reflected the lights in cruel, dancing patterns. I sat on the metal bench that ran along one wall, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles had gone white. The bench was bolted to the floor and barely wide enough for one person, but I shared the cell with 3 other women who'd clearly been through this routine before. First time? Asked a young woman with intricate tattoos covering her neck and arms. She couldn't have been more than 25, but her eyes held the weary knowledge of someone much older. Her hair was dyed an aggressive shade of purple, and she wore it like armor. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Yeah, I can tell. You got that deer in headlights thing going on. She laughed, but it wasn't cruel. What did they get you for? You don't look like the usual crowd. Stolen property, I whispered. The words felt foreign in my mouth, like speaking a language I'd never learned. Bullshit, said another woman from across the cell. She was older, maybe 40, with graying hair pulled back in a severe ponytail. Lady like you doesn't boost merchandise. You get set up. I looked at her sharply. What makes you say that? Because you're sitting there looking like someone kicked your puppy instead of like someone who got caught red-handed. Plus, that jewelry they brought you in with? Way too clean for street theft. That was professional-grade fencing material. Her words sent ice through my veins. Professional grade. As if someone had planned this carefully, deliberately. As if someone had wanted to ensure I'd be caught. My son sent it to me, I said quietly. I thought it was a Mother's Day gift. The tattooed girl whistled low.
Damn.
Blood betrayal. That's cold. The older woman shook her head. Family'll do dirtier than strangers every time. They know exactly where to stick the knife for maximum damage. When the payphone finally became available, I called Alex's number with shaking fingers. I'd memorized it years ago, back when we still talked regularly, back when he'd call me every Sunday just to check in. Now those digits felt like a prayer to a god who'd stopped listening. He answered on the 3rd ring. Mom. His voice sounded surprised, but underneath the surprise was something else, amusement, maybe, or satisfaction. Alex. My throat was so dry the words barely came out. Why would you? Why would I what? He sounded completely at ease, as if his mother calling him from jail was just another casual conversation. They found gold jewelry in a box you sent me. The police arrested me. They think it's stolen property. There was a pause, just long enough for me to hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Whoa, Mom, slow down. I didn't send you anything like that. Are you sure it wasn't some kind of mix-up? Maybe someone used my name by mistake. The lie came so smoothly, so naturally, that for a moment I almost believed him. This was Alex, after all. My son. The boy I'd rocked to sleep, whose fever I'd sat up all night monitoring, whose first steps I'd cheered like he'd just won an Olympic medal. But then I heard it, the slight uptick at the end of his sentences, the way his voice got when he was pleased with himself. The same tone he'd used as a teenager when he'd successfully talked his way out of trouble for something he'd absolutely done. Alex, please. I'm in jail. I need you to tell them this is all a mistake. I really gotta go, Mom. But hey, let me know if you need bail money or anything. I mean, if it's not too much. The casual cruelty of that last comment hit me like a slap. If it's not too much. As if my freedom was an inconvenience he might consider helping with if the price was right. Alex. The line went dead. I stood there for a long moment, holding the phone against my ear, listening to the dial tone like it might transform into my son's voice telling me this was all a horrible joke. But the only sound was the buzz of disconnection and the murmur of other inmates making their own desperate calls. That was the moment I knew with absolute certainty that my son, my beautiful, brilliant boy, had deliberately set me up to be arrested. He'd wrapped my destruction in pretty paper and sent it to me on Mother's Day like a gift. The trial was a swift, efficient humiliation. My court-appointed lawyer was a tired man in his 50s who smelled like coffee and defeat. He met with me for exactly 23 minutes before the hearing and spent most of that time reading my file for the first time. Mrs. Whitmore, the prosecution has you dead to rights on possession of stolen property. These pieces were identified as part of a larger theft ring that's been operating in the area for months. Your best bet is to cooperate. Tell them who you're working with, how the distribution network operates. I'm not working with anyone. I don't know anything about a theft ring. I told you. The jewelry was sent to me by my son. He looked at me with the patience of someone explaining basic math to a child. Ma'am, your son has provided an affidavit stating he's had no contact with you in years and certainly didn't send you any packages. He's also provided alibis showing he was out of state when the package was sent. The betrayal cut deeper than I thought possible. Alex hadn't just set me up. He'd prepared for it. He'd documented his innocence while ensuring my guilt. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act of cruelty. This was premeditated destruction. The jewelry was tied to a money laundering investigation, my lawyer continued. The prosecution believes you're part of a larger network. If you don't cooperate, they're going to throw the book at you. I can't cooperate with something I'm not part of.
He sighed.
Then you're looking at 18 months minimum. The gavel came down like thunder.
Guilty.
18 months. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair not unlike my own, looked at me with disgust as she read the sentence. Mrs. Whitmore, you've shown no remorse for your crimes and no willingness to cooperate with law enforcement. Your lack of honesty in this courtroom is disappointing from someone of your age and standing in the community. Standing in the community. I almost laughed. What's standing? My picture had been on the evening news for 3 nights running. Local woman arrested in jewelry theft ring. The headline had been accompanied by my mugshot, which made me look exactly like what everyone assumed I was, a criminal. Friends stopped calling within the first week. The phone would ring, I'd see a familiar name on the caller ID, and my heart would leap with hope. Then I'd answer, and after a few awkward pleasantries, they'd make excuses to hang up. Soon, the calls stopped coming altogether. Church was worse. I'd attended Riverside Methodist for 12 years, served on committees, baked for fundraisers, taught Sunday school. When I called Pastor Williams to explain what had happened, to ask for the congregation's prayers during this difficult time, his response was cold and final. Diane, I think it would be best if you found somewhere else to worship once this is all resolved. We have to think about our reputation in the community. Even God, it seemed, didn't want anything to do with me. The news coverage was relentless. They used the worst possible photo, my booking photo, where I looked haggard and guilty, and paired it with stock footage of expensive jewelry and police cars. The reporter, a young woman with perfect teeth and predatory eyes, stood outside my house and delivered her lines with barely concealed glee. Police say this quiet suburban home was the center of a sophisticated jewelry theft operation. Neighbors tell us they're shocked to learn that 58-year-old Diane Whitmore, who seemed like such a nice woman, was allegedly involved in criminal activity. They interviewed neighbors I'd known for years, people who'd borrowed cups of sugar and shared gossip over the fence. To a person, they all said the same thing. She seemed so normal. You never know who people really are. By the time the news cycle moved on to fresher scandals, my reputation was destroyed beyond repair. I was no longer Diane Whitmore, devoted mother and community member. I was Diane Whitmore, convicted felon. And through it all, Alex remained silent. No public statement defending me. No private call offering support. Nothing. Rick filed for divorce while I was awaiting sentencing. He had the papers served to me at the county jail, delivered by a bailiff who looked at me with barely concealed contempt. The divorce petition was brutal in its efficiency: irreconcilable differences, no alimony, no claim to the house we'd shared for 8 years. At the bottom of the last page, in Rick's careful handwriting, was a note: I can't be married to a criminal. I hope you understand. I understood perfectly. Rick had never loved me. He'd loved the idea of me. The respectable widow, the devoted mother, the woman who made him look good at country club dinners and charity galas. A convicted felon didn't fit that image, so I had to be discarded like an outfit that had gone out of style. The day before I was scheduled to report to prison, I sat in my empty house. Rick had already moved out, taking everything that mattered, and tried to call Alex one more time. The number was disconnected. He'd erased me completely. Prison is an education you never wanted, teaching lessons you never thought you'd need to learn. From the moment I walked through those doors, steel barriers that clanged shut behind me with the finality of a coffin lid, I knew the woman I'd been was gone forever. The intake process was designed to strip away every last shred of dignity. They took my clothes, my jewelry, even my wedding ring, though Rick had already made it clear that marriage was as dead as everything else in my former life. They gave me a uniform that smelled like industrial detergent and someone else's desperation. The fabric was coarse against my skin, a constant reminder that I no longer belonged to the world of soft cotton and gentle care. My cellmate was a woman named Rena Patterson, and she was nothing like what I'd expected from a criminal. She was 53, with graying brown hair she kept in a neat bun and intelligent hazel eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She could have been a librarian or a teacher, someone you'd trust with your children or your secrets. Instead, she was serving 7 years for embezzling $2 million from the investment firm where she'd worked as a senior partner. White-collar crime, she explained on my first night, as I lay on my narrow bunk staring at the ceiling. Same as you, I'm guessing. You don't have the look of someone who robbed convenience stores. Stolen property, I said quietly. Jewelry. But I didn't steal it. I didn't even know what it was. Rena was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, You got burned. It wasn't a question. By family? I nodded, though she couldn't see me in the darkness.
Ah.
Her voice carried a world of understanding. That's the worst kind. Strangers might rob you, but family destroys you. Over the following weeks, Rena became my unwitting professor in the advanced curriculum of betrayal and revenge. She'd been a legitimate businesswoman for 25 years before her own son, a gambling addict with a cocaine problem, had forged her signature on documents that made her complicit in his schemes. I spent 6 months trying to clear my name, she told me during one of our late-night conversations, when the guards were distracted and the other inmates were asleep. I hired lawyers, private investigators, forensic accountants. I spent my life savings trying to prove my innocence. What happened? I realized innocence doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is what you can prove, and Marcus had been very careful to make sure all the evidence pointed to me. He'd been planning it for years, setting up accounts in my name, using my credentials, building a paper trail that made me look like the mastermind. The similarity to my own situation was chilling. Alex had sent me that jewelry knowing exactly what would happen. He'd prepared alibis, cut off contact to establish distance, and probably planted evidence to ensure my conviction. This hadn't been a moment of anger or desperation. It had been a carefully orchestrated campaign. "So, what did you do?" I asked. Rena's smile was sharp in the darkness. "I stopped trying to prove I wasn't guilty, and I started planning to make sure Marcus paid for making me guilty. That was when my real education began." Rena had learned things in prison that they don't teach in business school. She discovered networks of women who'd been betrayed, abandoned, and destroyed by people they trusted. Women who'd been forced to become harder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous than their former selves. "You want to get even with your son?" Rena asked one evening as we sat in the common area, pretending to watch television while actually planning my future. "I want him to lose everything," I said. The words surprised me with their venom. A year ago, I would have been horrified to hear such hatred in my own voice. Now, it felt like the most honest thing I'd said in months. "Then you don't scream. You don't throw punches. You don't do anything that leaves fingerprints or witnesses. You take him apart piece by piece, surgically, quietly. So, by the time he realizes what's happening, it's already too late to stop it." She taught me about shell companies, how to create business entities that existed only on paper but could hold real assets, move real money, and shield real operations from scrutiny. She explained offshore banking, how to hide money in art purchases and precious metals, how to use legitimate businesses as fronts for illegitimate activities. "Your son probably thinks he's untouchable," she said. "Men like that always do. They think they're smarter than everyone else, that they've covered all their tracks. But everyone has vulnerabilities. Everyone has pressure points. You just have to find them and apply the right amount of force in the right places." But the most valuable lessons weren't about money or business structures. They were about psychology, about understanding what motivated people and how to use those motivations against them. "People like your son, manipulators, narcissists, they have predictable patterns," Rena explained. "They need to feel superior, to be the smartest person in the room. They can't resist showing off, especially when they think they're safe. That arrogance is their weakness." I absorbed every lesson like a student cramming for the most important exam of my life. I learned about anonymous tips that couldn't be traced back to their source, about how to plant seeds of doubt that would grow into paranoia and destroy relationships from within. Other inmates contributed their own expertise. Maria, who was serving time for identity theft, taught me about creating untraceable communications and false identities. Janet, a former bookkeeper who'd been caught skimming from her employer, showed me how to hide financial transactions in plain sight. Slowly, methodically, I began to construct a plan for Alex's destruction. Not the hot, angry revenge of someone acting on emotion, but the cold, calculated vengeance of someone who'd had time to think, time to learn, and time to let hatred crystallize into something harder than diamond. I stopped thinking like a mother. I stopped making excuses for Alex, stopped hoping he might have had good reasons for what he'd done. I stopped seeing him as my child and started seeing him as my enemy. The woman who'd entered prison 18 months earlier, the naive, trusting mother who'd believed family meant something sacred, was gone. In her place was someone harder, sharper, infinitely more dangerous. Someone who understood that love was a weapon that could be used against you, and that the only way to survive was to become the person your enemies least expected you to be. I was no longer Diane Whitmore, victim. I was becoming something else entirely. They released me on a Tuesday morning in October, 3 months early for good behavior. I walked out of those prison gates carrying everything I owned in a plastic bag, a few letters from lawyers, the divorce papers Rick had sent, and exactly $47 from my commissary account. No one was waiting for me. No family, no friends, no familiar faces to mark the transition from inmate back to citizen. The bus stop was a quarter-mile away, and I walked that distance slowly, feeling the weight of freedom like an unfamiliar coat. The world had moved on without me. New buildings had gone up, familiar storefronts had changed hands, and the people on the street looked right through me as if I were invisible. In a way, I was Diane Whitmore, the woman who'd gone to prison, no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Her house was gone, sold to pay legal fees. Her marriage was dissolved. Her friends had evaporated like morning mist. But that invisibility, I realized, was a gift. Dead people can't be held accountable for what they do. I rented a studio apartment in a part of town I'd never had reason to visit before, 6 blocks of aging buildings and tired dreams, where landlords didn't ask too many questions if you paid first month's rent in cash. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a converted warehouse, and it smelled like old cooking oil and disappointment. The name on the lease was Claire Lewis, a perfectly ordinary name that belonged to no one and everyone. I'd learned in prison how to acquire the basic documents needed to become someone else. A social security number that had belonged to a child who died decades ago, a birth certificate that could pass casual inspection, a driver's license that would get me through most situations. Claire Lewis was a middle-aged woman with no history, no connections, and no one looking for her. She was exactly what I needed to be. I found work at an all-night diner on the edge of the industrial district, the kind of place that served coffee and breakfast to truckers, factory workers, and insomniacs with nowhere else to go. The pay was minimum wage plus tips, entirely in cash, and the manager didn't care about my background as long as I showed up on time and didn't steal from the register. My shift ran from midnight to 8 a.m., which meant I spent my days sleeping and my evenings planning. The diner was perfect for my purposes. Dead hours between customers gave me time to research, and the all-night Wi-Fi let me dig into Alex's life without leaving digital traces that could be connected to Diane Whitmore. What I found made my blood run cold. Alex had reinvented himself completely in the 18 months I'd been gone. He'd moved from his old apartment to a luxury high-rise downtown, driving a black Tesla and wearing suits that cost more than I'd made in a month at the diner. His social media presence showed a life of careful affluence, expensive restaurants, weekend trips to Miami, a beautiful girlfriend who posed for photos like a professional model. Her name was Isabella Martinez, and she had 200,000 Instagram followers who hung on her every carefully curated post. She was 26, stunning in that artificial way that came from good genetics and better plastic surgery, and completely devoted to Alex if her posts were to be believed. My amazing boyfriend surprised me with dinner at Le Bernardin. She'd posted 3 weeks earlier, along with photos of herself in a designer dress that probably cost more than my annual salary. I'm the luckiest girl in the world. But the money troubled me. Alex had been working as a mid-level sales manager for a software company when we'd last spoken. Good money, certainly, but not Tesla money. Not luxury condo money. Not fly your girlfriend to Miami for the weekend money. I dug deeper, using skills Rena had taught me and resources I'd never known existed. Public records, business filings, property transactions, all of it was available if you knew where to look and how to interpret what you found. Alex was listed as a partner in 3 different LLCs: Meridian Solutions, Apex Holdings, and Cornerstone Investments. On paper, they looked legitimate, consulting firms and investment groups with impressive addresses and professional websites. But when I traced the money flow, the picture became clearer and more disturbing. The companies were shells, elaborate constructions designed to obscure the movement of money rather than generate legitimate profits. Funds flowed in from dozens of smaller investors, were shuffled between the various entities through a maze of transactions, and eventually emerged as Alex's personal income. It was a Ponzi scheme, sophisticated and carefully managed, but a Ponzi scheme nonetheless. Alex was stealing from investors, using their money to fund his lifestyle, while promising returns he could never deliver. But that wasn't the worst of it. Buried in the business filings was a name that made my heart stop: Marcus Patterson. Rena's son, the gambling addict who destroyed her life and sent her to prison. He was listed as a silent partner in Meridian Solutions. Alex wasn't just running a scam. He was working with someone who'd already proven he was willing to destroy his own mother for money. They were partners in crime, literally and figuratively. The final piece of the puzzle came from a source I hadn't expected: police records that had been sealed during my trial, but were now available through a contact Maria had given me, a former cop who supplemented his pension by selling information to people who knew how to ask the right questions. 2 years earlier, just before Alex had sent me that box of jewelry, his business partner in an earlier venture had died in what police had called a home invasion gone wrong. Thomas Kellerman, age 43, had been found beaten to death in his suburban home. The case had gone cold within 6 months, no suspects, no arrests. But the timeline told a different story. Kellerman had died just 2 weeks after filing a complaint with the state attorney general's office, alleging that Alex had embezzled nearly $500,000 from their joint business account. The complaint had died with Kellerman, and Alex had used that $500,000 to seed his current operation. I sat in my tiny apartment at 3 in the morning, surrounded by printouts and photographs and documentation of my son's crimes, and felt something cold and final settle in my chest. Alex hadn't just betrayed me. He'd most likely murdered a man to cover up his theft, then framed me to remove a potential witness to his activities. He'd wanted me gone permanently. Prison had been just the first step. But I wasn't gone. I was very much alive, and I was learning things about my son that he'd never imagined I could discover. The mother in me wanted to weep for the monster my beautiful boy had become. But the woman I'd been forged into in prison felt only cold satisfaction. I had him now. Everything I needed to destroy him completely. It was time to begin. Revenge, I'd learned from Rena, was like gardening. You had to prepare the soil carefully, plant the right seeds in the right places, and tend them patiently until they grew into something that could strangle the life out of what you wanted to destroy. My first target wasn't Alex himself. That would come later. I started with his business partners, the greedy, gullible men who'd trusted him with their money and their secrets. Marcus Patterson was easy to find. Unlike his careful mother, he was careless with his digital footprint, posting constantly on social media about his gambling wins, his expensive clothes, his nights out at exclusive clubs. He thought he was untouchable now, insulated by Alex's success from the consequences of his past actions. I called him on a Thursday evening, using a burner phone and a voice modulator app that made me sound like a middle-aged man with a slight Boston accent. Marcus? This is Detective Frank Sullivan, Boston PD. I'm working a cold case that might involve you. I could hear the panic in his breathing. What kind of cold case? Money laundering, fraud, possible murder. Your name came up in connection with a business partner named Alex Whitmore. I was hoping we could have a conversation. I don't know what you're talking about. I barely know Alex Whitmore. Funny, because your name is all over his business filings. Look, Marcus, I'm trying to do you a favor here. We've got evidence that Whitmore's been skimming from joint accounts. If you're clean, now's the time to distance yourself. If you're not, I let the threat hang in the air. I need to call my lawyer.
You do that.
But Marcus? If I were you, I'd be very careful about what you tell Alex Whitmore about this conversation. Men who steal from their partners don't usually leave loose ends untied, if you know what I mean. I hung up and waited. It took less than 6 hours for Marcus to crack. He called Alex at 2 in the morning, drunk and paranoid, babbling about police investigations and murder charges. I knew this because I'd planted a listening device in Alex's apartment 3 weeks earlier, a skill I'd learned from Janet, who'd used similar techniques to monitor her former employer's communications. Slow down, Marcus. What exactly did this detective say? He said they had evidence you were stealing money. He said something about murder. Alex, if the cops are looking at us.
Calm down.
It's probably nothing. Some fishing expedition. But I could hear the strain in Alex's voice, the first tiny crack in his confidence. He was rattled, and rattled people made mistakes. My next call was to David Chun, one of Alex's newer investors. According to the financial records I'd obtained, Chun had put nearly $200,000 into Meridian Solutions 6 months earlier, expecting quarterly returns that hadn't materialized. Mr. Chun? This is Sarah Williams from the State Securities Division. We've received some complaints about an investment firm you may have dealt with, Meridian Solutions? Yes, I invested with them. Is there a problem? We're investigating possible securities fraud. Have you received the returns you were promised? There was a long pause. No, actually. They keep telling me the money is tied up in complex transactions, but I haven't seen a penny of profit. Mr. Chun, I need to ask you to be very careful about any further investments with this company. And if they contact you asking for additional funds, please notify our office immediately. I made similar calls to 8 other investors over the next 2 weeks, each one carefully calibrated to plant doubt without providing enough information for them to compare notes and realize they'd all received identical warnings. The effect was immediate and devastating. Alex's phone started ringing constantly. Investors demanding explanations, partners asking uncomfortable questions, business associates suddenly becoming unavailable for meetings. But I wasn't finished. The real masterpiece was yet to come. Isabella Martinez, Alex's beautiful girlfriend, was vain in the way that only truly insecure people could be. Her Instagram feed was a carefully curated fantasy of perfect skin, perfect hair, perfect life. She lived for the validation of strangers, for the comments and likes that told her she was worthy of love. I created a series of anonymous accounts, middle-aged women with bland profile pictures and generic names. Over the course of several weeks, I began commenting on Isabella's posts, always supportively at first. You look amazing, girl. Relationship goals. So jealous of your life. But then, gradually, I began introducing poison. Is that the same dress from 3 posts ago? Just checking because my boyfriend would never let me wear the same designer piece twice to events. Your skin looks a little different in this photo. New filter. Wait, didn't you say your boyfriend was taking you to Paris for your birthday? That looks like Miami again. The comments were subtle enough to avoid deletion, but pointed enough to sting. And, because they came from multiple accounts, they looked like genuine observations from her followers rather than coordinated attacks. Isabella began responding defensively, then angrily. Her posts became more frequent and more desperate, trying to prove her lifestyle was as perfect as she claimed. The comments grew more critical, and her follower count began to drop. But the killing blow came from an unexpected source. I'd hired a private investigator, a discreet woman who specialized in matrimonial cases, to follow Alex for a week. The photos she brought back were everything I'd hoped for and more. Alex with a blonde woman at an expensive restaurant. Alex with the same blonde entering a hotel. Alex with a different brunette at a wine bar downtown. 3 different women in 5 days, all while Isabella was posting about what a devoted boyfriend he was. I sent the photos to Isabella anonymously, along with a simple message. Thought you should know what your amazing boyfriend does when you're not around. The explosion was immediate and public. Isabella's Instagram story became a 24-hour documentary of her breakdown, Tearful selfies, screenshots of angry text messages to Alex, videos of her throwing his belongings out of her apartment window. Cheating, lying scumbag, she posted along with a photo of Alex's expensive watch lying broken on the sidewalk. 3 years of my life wasted on this pathetic excuse for a man. The story was picked up by gossip blogs, then by local news. Instagram influencer exposes cheating boyfriend in epic social media meltdown. Alex's name and face were suddenly everywhere, associated with infidelity and emotional abuse. His professional reputation began to crumble. Potential investors Googled his name and found Isabella's meltdown as the top result. Business partners started distancing themselves from the scandal. His Tesla was repossessed 2 weeks later. Apparently, the monthly payments had been coming from an account Isabella had access to, and she'd emptied it in her rage. But I still wasn't satisfied. The humiliation was satisfying, but it wasn't justice. Alex had destroyed my life, framed me for crimes I didn't commit, and quite possibly murdered a man. Public embarrassment wasn't enough. It was time to bring down the entire structure he'd built. The beauty of destroying a Ponzi scheme is that you don't have to do most of the work yourself. Once investors start demanding their money back simultaneously, the structure collapses under its own weight. All you have to do is light the fuse and step back. I chose my moment carefully. Alex was already reeling from the Isabella disaster, his attention scattered and his confidence shaken. His business partners were nervous, his investors were asking questions, and his personal life was splattered across social media like roadkill. The final push came in the form of a single email sent from an anonymous account to every investor in Alex's 3 shell companies simultaneously. You deserve to know the truth about Alex Whitmore and your investments. Check the public records for Meridian Solutions, Apex Holdings, and Cornerstone Investments. Look at the money flows. Ask yourself why your returns never materialized while Alex drives a Tesla and lives in a luxury condo. Ask yourself what happened to Thomas Kellerman when he started asking similar questions. The authorities have been notified. Save yourselves while you still can. I hit send at 3:17 a.m. on a Friday morning and waited for the avalanche. It started slowly. David Chen was the first to call Alex, demanding an immediate meeting and the return of his investment. By noon, 3 other investors had made similar demands. By evening, Alex's voicemail was full and his email inbox was flooded with increasingly angry messages. Marcus Patterson cracked first, just as I'd known he would. By Sunday, he was sitting in a conference room at the FBI field office, spilling everything he knew about Alex's operations in exchange for immunity from prosecution. His cooperation led to search warrants for Alex's apartment, his offices, and his bank accounts. The financial records told the story I'd already discovered. Millions of dollars in investor funds diverted to personal accounts, fraudulent statements claiming profits that had never existed, and a complex shell game designed to keep the money flowing in while preventing anyone from tracking where it actually went. But the FBI found something I hadn't known about. Communications between Alex and a man named Vincent Torino, who had connections to organized crime and specialized in making problems disappear permanently. The emails were carefully coded, but their meaning was clear to anyone who understood the language of violence. Thomas Kellerman hadn't died in a random home invasion. He'd been murdered on Alex's orders. The arrest came on a Tuesday morning. I watched from across the street as federal agents surrounded Alex's building, their black SUVs blocking every exit. Alex was let out in handcuffs, still wearing his expensive suit but looking smaller somehow, diminished by the reality of consequences finally catching up to him. The local news trucks arrived within an hour. By evening, Alex's arrest was the lead story on every channel. Local man arrested in million-dollar Ponzi scheme. The reporters who had once covered my own arrest with such glee now turned their cameras on my son, dissecting his crimes with the same ruthless efficiency they'd used to destroy my reputation. But unlike my case, where I'd been painted as a suburban housewife who'd inexplicably turned to crime, Alex's story fit a more familiar narrative. The handsome young businessman who'd let greed corrupt him, who'd betrayed the trust of friends and investors, who'd possibly committed murder to protect his secrets. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Financial records, witness testimony from Marcus and other cooperating partners, communications with Vincent Torino, and a paper trail that connected him directly to Thomas Kellerman's murder. The prosecutor called it one of the most clear-cut cases of fraud and conspiracy to commit murder he'd ever seen. Alex's lawyer, a high-priced criminal defense attorney who specialized in white-collar crime, tried to paint his client as a victim of circumstances, a young man who'd gotten in over his head and made some poor decisions. But the murder charge made that narrative impossible to sustain. I attended every day of the trial, sitting in the back row of the courtroom gallery wearing dark glasses and a wig that changed my appearance enough to avoid recognition. I wanted to see Alex's face when the verdict was read. I wanted to watch him realize that his mother, the woman he dismissed as weak and expendable, had orchestrated his complete destruction. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They traced the money flows, demonstrated the fraudulent statements, and played recorded conversations between Alex and his co-conspirators. The murder charge was supported by phone records, financial transfers to Vincent Torino, and testimony from Marcus about Alex's escalating paranoia regarding Thomas Kellerman's threats to expose the fraud. Alex tried to maintain his composure, but I could see the cracks forming. His expensive suits couldn't hide the weight loss, the hollow cheeks, the dark circles under his eyes. He looked like a man who'd finally realized he wasn't as smart as he'd always believed. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. Guilty on all counts: fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and murder in the first degree. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the bailiffs led Alex away in shackles, he turned and scanned the courtroom gallery. For just a moment, his eyes met mine. I saw recognition flicker across his face, followed by something that might have been understanding. He knew. In that instant, he understood exactly who had destroyed him and why. I smiled at him then, the cold, satisfied smile of someone who'd waited 2 years for this moment. The last thing Alex saw before they led him away was his mother's face, no longer the weak, trusting woman he'd betrayed, but the architect of his ruin. Justice, I thought, had finally been served. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and cameras as Alex was led away to begin his life sentence. I stood at the edge of the crowd, close enough to hear the prosecutor's statement to the press, but far enough back to avoid the cameras. Alex Whitmore preyed on the trust of hardworking people who believed in his promises, the prosecutor said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a job well done. He stole their life savings, destroyed their dreams, and when someone threatened to expose him, he arranged for that person to be murdered. Today's verdict shows that no one is above the law, regardless of how charming or successful they may appear. A reporter shouted a question about the other victims. What about the investors who lost everything? Will they see any restitution? The FBI has seized all of Mr. Whitmore's assets, including his condo, his vehicles, and several offshore accounts. While it won't make the victims whole, some recovery is expected. I allowed myself a small smile. Even in defeat, Alex was still providing me with opportunities for revenge. Over the next several weeks, I watched with satisfaction as every piece of Alex's carefully constructed life was dismantled and sold at auction. The luxury condo went for significantly less than market value, apparently. Being known as the home of a convicted murderer and fraudster wasn't good for property values. The Tesla was sold to pay legal fees. Even his expensive watches and designer suits were liquidated to satisfy court orders. But my personal favorite was what happened to Isabella Martinez. Her association with Alex had destroyed her influencer career completely. Brand partnerships evaporated, followers abandoned her in droves, and her attempts to rebrand herself as a victim of his deception fell flat. She tried to leverage the scandal into sympathy, but the public had seen her earlier posts celebrating the lavish lifestyle Alex's crimes had funded. Ignorance isn't an excuse when you're flaunting blood money on social media. One particularly harsh comment read. It had received over 3,000 likes. Isabella eventually deleted all her social media accounts and moved back to her hometown in Ohio, her dreams of fame and fortune as dead as Alex's freedom. Marcus Patterson, despite his cooperation with the FBI, didn't escape consequences entirely. The State Securities Commission banned him from working in any financial capacity for life, and several of the investors filed civil suits against him personally. He'd avoided prison, but his reputation and career were finished. But the sweetest revenge of all was what happened to Vincent Torino, the man Alex had hired to kill Thomas Kellerman. When the FBI raided Alex's computers, they found enough evidence to connect Torino not just to Kellerman's murder, but to 3 other unsolved homicides dating back 5 years. Torino was arrested 6 months after Alex's trial, and his conviction led to the reopening of those cold cases. Families who'd thought they'd never see justice for their loved ones finally got answers. Alex's downfall had created a cascade effect that brought down an entire network of criminals.
I found a particular satisfaction in that.
Alex had thought he was so clever, so careful, so untouchable. But in reality, he'd been nothing more than a small-time criminal who'd gotten lucky for a while. When the luck ran out, it ran out completely. With Alex's trial concluded and his life thoroughly destroyed, I faced a question I hadn't expected. What do you do when your revenge is complete? I'd spent 2 years focused entirely on bringing down my son. Every decision, every action, every waking moment had been directed toward that single goal. Now that it was accomplished, I felt oddly empty, like an actor who'd finished a long-running play and didn't know what to do with the stage. Claire Lewis had served her purpose, but she was a hollow identity built for destruction rather than creation. If I was going to build a new life, I needed to become someone more substantial, someone with a future rather than just a vengeful past. I started by using the skills I'd learned in prison and refined during my campaign against Alex. The financial techniques Rena had taught me, the identity construction methods Maria had shared, the careful documentation habits Janet had instilled. All of it could be used for legitimate purposes as well as criminal ones. I had money now, more than I'd ever had access to before. During my investigation of Alex's finances, I discovered several accounts he'd hidden from the FBI, money he'd squirreled away in case he needed to disappear quickly. Those accounts had become my nest egg, funding my transformation from victim to survivor. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was building my new life with money Alex had stolen from his victims. But I preferred to think of it as compensating myself for the 18 months of my life he'd stolen, for the reputation he destroyed, for the mother's love he'd betrayed. I bought a small house in a quiet neighborhood 3 states away, far enough from my old life to avoid accidental recognition, but close enough to civilization to matter. It was a modest place, nothing like the luxury I'd shared with Rick, but it was mine in a way that mattered more than legal ownership. The name on the deed was Diana Walsh, a carefully constructed identity with a believable backstory. Diana was a widow who'd moved to town to be closer to her sister after her husband's death from cancer. She'd worked in accounting for most of her career, which explained her financial acumen, and she was looking for a quiet retirement away from painful memories. Diana Walsh was everything Diane Whitmore had been before Alex destroyed her life, but stronger, smarter, more careful about who she trusted. I opened a small accounting practice, serving local businesses and individuals who needed help with their books, but couldn't afford the big firms in the city. Word of mouth brought me a steady stream of clients, and I found genuine satisfaction in helping honest people manage their finances legally and efficiently. For the first time in years, I was using my intelligence and skills to build something rather than destroy it. The work was challenging enough to keep me engaged, profitable enough to ensure my security, and legitimate enough to let me sleep peacefully at night. But I never forgot the lessons Alex had taught me about trust and family. Diana Walsh was friendly, but not close with her neighbors, professional, but not personal with her clients. She had acquaintances, but no intimate friends, business relationships, but no emotional dependencies. She'd learned that love was a luxury she could no longer afford. 3 years after Alex's conviction, I thought I'd put the past behind me completely. Diana Walsh had a comfortable life, a successful business, and the kind of peaceful anonymity I'd never appreciated until I'd lost it. I should have known it couldn't last. The knock on my door came on a Saturday evening in September. I was in my kitchen, a smaller, warmer space than the one where this whole nightmare had begun, preparing dinner and listening to classical music on the radio. The sound was different from that long-ago Mother's Day morning, gentler, more hesitant, almost apologetic. Through the peephole, I saw a young woman I didn't recognize. She was perhaps 30, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and tired eyes that reminded me of someone I couldn't quite place. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, nothing threatening or official. "Ms. Walsh," she said when I opened the door. "My name is Sarah Kellerman. I think we need to talk." The last name hit me like a physical blow.
Kellerman.
Thomas Kellerman, the business partner Alex had murdered, the man whose death had started the chain reaction that led to my son's downfall. "I'm sorry," I said carefully. "I don't think we've met." "You're right, we haven't. But I know who you are, Mrs. Whitmore. And I know what you did to Alex." My blood turned to ice. Diana Walsh was supposed to be invisible, untraceable, completely separate from Diane Whitmore's destroyed life. If this woman had found me, if she'd connected the two identities, then everything I'd built was at risk. "I think you have me confused with someone else," I said, starting to close the door. "My father was Thomas Kellerman," she said quickly. "The man your son had killed. Please, I just want to talk. I'm not here to hurt you or expose you. I just need to understand." Against every instinct screaming at me to slam the door and disappear, I let her in. Sometimes the only way out of a trap is through it. Sarah Kellerman sat in my living room and told me about her father with the kind of love I'd once had for Alex. Thomas had been a good man, she said, honest to a fault, the kind of person who always assumed the best about others until they proved him wrong. He trusted Alex completely, she said, her voice thick with old pain. They'd been friends since college, and when Alex approached him about starting a business together, Dad didn't hesitate. He put everything into that partnership, his savings, his reputation, his future. I listened without commenting, letting her tell the story I already knew, but had never heard from this perspective. When Dad started noticing irregularities in the accounts, he tried to talk to Alex about it privately first. He didn't want to believe his friend was stealing from him. But the evidence was undeniable, and Dad felt he had no choice but to report it. She paused, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. 3 days after he filed the complaint with the state, someone broke into his house and beat him to death with a baseball bat. The police said it was a burglary gone wrong, but nothing was stolen. Nothing except my father's life. "I'm sorry for your loss," I said quietly. And I meant it. Whatever else Alex had done, Thomas Kellerman had been an innocent man who died simply for being honest. "I never believed it was random," Sarah continued. "I hired private investigators, offered rewards, did everything I could to find the truth. But the case went cold, and eventually I had to accept that I might never know what really happened." She looked at me directly then, and I saw steel beneath the grief. Until Alex was arrested. Until the trial revealed that he'd hired Vincent Torino to kill my father. Until I realized that someone had orchestrated Alex's downfall with surgical precision, someone who had intimate knowledge of his operations and unlimited patience for revenge. My mouth was dry, but I kept my expression neutral. What makes you think I was involved? Because I'm an investigative journalist, Mrs. Whitmore. It's what I do for a living. And when I dug into Alex's destruction, I found fingerprints everywhere, anonymous tips that led to his exposure, coordinated attacks on his personal relationships, financial pressure applied at exactly the right moments. Someone had spent months studying him, learning his weaknesses, and systematically destroying everything he'd built. She pulled a file folder from her bag and set it on my coffee table. I know about Claire Lewis, the woman who worked at the all-night diner and disappeared right after Alex's arrest. I know about the burner phones used to make calls to his business partners. I know about the private investigator who took photos of Alex cheating on his girlfriend. And I know that Diana Walsh appeared in this town with a perfectly constructed background and enough money to start fresh just a few months after Alex was sentenced. I was impressed despite myself. Sarah Kellerman had inherited her father's attention to detail and combined it with professional investigative skills. She'd done in months what it had taken the FBI years to accomplish. "What do you want?" I asked. "I want to thank you," she said simply. "My father's killer is in prison for the rest of his life because of what you did. I could never have gotten justice for him on my own. I didn't have the resources, the connections, or the specialized knowledge it took to bring Alex down. But you did. You avenged my father's death while avenging your own betrayal." I studied her face for signs of deception, for hidden agendas or ulterior motives. But all I saw was genuine gratitude and a grief that mirrored my own. "I also want to ask you a favor," she continued. "I'm writing a book about my father's case, about Alex's crimes, about how justice sometimes comes from unexpected sources. I won't use your real name or reveal your location, but I'd like to tell the story of how a mother's love turned into a weapon that brought down a killer. And if I refuse, then I'll respect your privacy and leave you alone. Diana Walsh can continue her quiet life, and Diane Whitmore can remain a ghost. I'm not here to threaten or blackmail you. I'm here to offer you the chance to tell your side of the story, to show the world that sometimes the victims fight back and win." I considered her offer for a long moment. There was risk in it, certainly. Even a carefully anonymized account might attract unwanted attention, might lead others to start asking questions about Diana Walsh's true identity. But there was also an appeal to the idea of having my story told, of showing the world that Alex's victims hadn't just been passive casualties of his greed. That at least one of us had refused to stay down, had learned to fight back, had turned his own weapons against him. "I'll think about it," I said finally. Sarah nodded and stood to leave. At the door, she turned back one more time. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Whitmore, I think you did the right thing. Alex destroyed a lot of lives, and the system failed to stop him. Sometimes justice has to come from outside the law." After she left, I sat in my living room for hours, thinking about fathers and children, about love and betrayal, about the different ways people respond to having their lives destroyed by someone they trusted. Sarah Kellerman had channeled her grief into professional purpose, using her skills as a journalist to seek truth and understanding. I had channeled mine into cold revenge, using skills learned in prison to systematically destroy my son's life. Neither approach was wrong. We'd both found ways to honor our dead, her father, my former self, by refusing to let their destroyers escape consequences. A week later, I called Sarah and told her I'd cooperate with her book under the conditions she'd outlined. She kept her word. The book was published 18 months later, telling the story of Thomas Kellerman's murder and Alex Whitmore's downfall without revealing any details that could lead back to Diana Walsh. But she captured something important in those pages. The story of how victims could become victors, how the seemingly powerless could learn to fight back, how love betrayed could transform into something harder and more dangerous than the betrayer ever imagined. The book became a bestseller, and Sarah donated a portion of the proceeds to a victims' rights organization in her father's name. Alex's story became a cautionary tale about the consequences of greed and betrayal, his crimes a reminder that even the most careful criminals eventually made mistakes that brought them down. I never heard from Sarah again after the book was published, but I followed her career from a distance. She won several journalism awards for her investigative work, married a fellow reporter, and had 2 children she named Thomas and Diana, honoring both her father and the anonymous woman who'd helped her find justice. Sometimes I thought the best revenge was living well enough to inspire others to do the same. 5 years have passed since Alex's conviction, and Diana Walsh has become more real to me than Diane Whitmore ever was. This small house, this quiet life, this carefully constructed anonymity, they represent something I never had before. The freedom to be exactly who I choose to be, without the weight of other people's expectations or betrayals. My accounting practice has grown beyond what I'd ever expected. Word of mouth in a small town is powerful, and apparently I have a reputation for helping people protect their money from those who would steal it. There's an irony in that I appreciate every day. Mrs. Henderson, who owns the local bakery, brings me her books every month and always leaves with a box of her famous chocolate chip cookies. "You've saved me thousands in taxes," she always says. "It's the least I can do." Tom Rodriguez, who runs a small construction company, credits me with helping him navigate the financial crisis when the pandemic hit. "Without your advice about restructuring my loans, I would have lost everything," he told me last Christmas. These people trust me with their livelihood, their dreams, their futures. They have no idea that their quiet, reliable accountant once orchestrated the complete destruction of her own son. They see only Diana Walsh, the widow who moved to town to start fresh, who's never late with her tax filings and always has sound advice about financial planning. I've never told them that the money I used to buy this house and start this business came from accounts my son hid from the FBI, stolen from investors whose trust he betrayed. Some secrets are meant to be carried alone.
I don't sleep badly anymore.
The nightmares that plagued me in the first months after Alex's conviction have faded into occasional, manageable dreams. I've made peace with what I did, with the choices I made, with the woman I became. Alex is where he belongs, serving a life sentence in a maximum security federal prison. I've resisted the temptation to monitor his situation closely, but occasionally information finds its way to me. He's been attacked twice by other inmates. Apparently, men who hurt children and elderly people aren't popular in prison. Both times he survived, though not without scars. I'm not sorry about that. Some lessons are only learned through pain. Isabella Martinez never recovered from her association with Alex. Last I heard, she was working as a sales clerk in a department store in Cleveland, her dreams of social media fame as dead as her relationship with my son. She's tried to restart her online presence several times, but the internet never forgets, and there are always people ready to remind the world of her connection to a convicted murderer. Marcus Patterson declared bankruptcy 2 years after Alex's trial and now drives a delivery truck for a living. His mother, Rena, was released from prison 6 months after Alex's conviction. I like to think her lessons served us both well. Vincent Torino died in prison. A heart attack, they said, though rumor suggested it might have been helped along by someone who had a problem with hired killers. I shed no tears for him. The investors Alex defrauded received partial restitution from the liquidation of his assets, though most will never recover completely from their losses. David Chin sent me a letter once, somehow tracking down Diana Walsh's address, thanking me for the anonymous warning that prompted him to withdraw some of his money before the scheme collapsed entirely. He doesn't know that the woman who warned him was also the mother of the man who stole from him. That letter sits in a frame on my desk, a reminder that sometimes doing the right thing means breaking the law. Rick remarried within a year of our divorce, choosing a younger woman with no criminal record and no messy family complications. I heard they moved to Arizona, where his new wife's family has connections in real estate. I hope he's happy. I hope she never discovers what kind of man he really is when the stakes get high enough. But mostly, I don't think about any of them anymore. The past is a foreign country where I no longer hold citizenship. Diane Whitmore died in that courtroom when the judge's gavel fell on Alex's life sentence. Diana Walsh was born from her ashes, stronger and wiser, and infinitely more careful about who she trusts. Today is Mother's Day, and for the first time in 6 years, I'm celebrating it. Not because I'm anyone's mother anymore. That part of my life ended when Alex sent me that box of stolen jewelry, but because I've learned to mother myself, to protect myself, to fight for myself when no one else will. I'm sitting on my back porch with a cup of coffee and the morning newspaper, watching the sun rise over a garden I planted with my own hands. The roses are blooming beautifully this year, their red petals bright against the green leaves. I chose red because it's the color of strength, of survival, of blood that refuses to be spilled in vain. Mrs. Henderson stopped by yesterday with a Mother's Day card and a box of cookies. "I know you don't have children nearby," she said, "but you've been like a mother to this whole community, looking after our finances the way you do." If only she knew. I've thought about having children in this new life, about finding someone to love and trust and build a family with. But every time the possibility presents itself, I remember Alex's face when he learned I was his mother's destroyer. I remember the cold calculation in his voice when he denied sending me that jewelry. I remember the 18 months I spent in prison for crimes I didn't commit, betrayed by the son I'd loved more than my own life. Some wounds heal stronger than the original flesh. Others leave you permanently changed, unable to ever be what you were before. I'm at peace with that. Diana Walsh doesn't need children or a husband or anyone else to validate her existence. She has her work, her house, her carefully tended garden. She has the satisfaction of knowing that when someone tried to destroy her, she learned to destroy them back, completely, professionally, and without leaving fingerprints. That's a kind of strength they don't teach in parenting classes. The newspaper has a small item on page 3 about a federal prisoner who was found dead in his cell yesterday. Heart attack, they think, though he was young and had no history of cardiac problems. His name was Vincent Torino. I smile and turn the page. Some stories end with forgiveness and reconciliation, with families reunited and love conquering all. This isn't one of those stories. This is the story of a woman who learned that sometimes the people who hurt you most are the ones who claim to love you, and that sometimes the only way to heal is to become someone they can never hurt again. My name is Diana Walsh. I'm 58 years old. I live in a small town where everyone knows my name, and I've never been happier in my life. The woman who is Diane Whitmore, who loved her son more than herself, who trusted in the goodness of family and the power of unconditional love, she's gone forever. And I don't miss her at all. Thank you for listening to Her Journey. If this story spoke to your soul, please subscribe for more tales of survival, revenge, and the strength we find when we refuse to stay down. Remember, sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's becoming someone your enemies could never imagine.